Hey, Jay Smith here in Kazan, in Russia, Tatarstan, refuting the Takfir production video concerning Takfir. Very close to Takfir, isn't it? Lying. Put out by Abdullah and Issa. Two friends of mine, they may not call me that, from Speaker's Corner, who are trying desperately to prove that we are people that like to lie. And I think what was rather fascinating is when they went to Paul to prove their point. They went to the letters of Paul and to the writings of Paul, to 1 Corinthians 9, 19 to 24, particularly zeroing in on verse 22. They went to Philippians 1, verse 18, and then they also went to Romans 3, 7, which they think assumes that gives us permission to lie. In fact, Paul uses it. Let me just quote these verses. We'll start with 1 Corinthians 9, verses 21 and 22, because these are the two that they're looking at. This is what Paul says. To those not having the law, that means the Gentiles who are not under the law, I become like one not having the law. He becomes like a Gentile. Though he says, I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law. That should say it right there. He's under Christ's law. He becomes like them, but there's a higher law that he has to subsist to, and that is Christ's law. So as to win those not having the law. Verse 22, to the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. And what both Abdullah and Issa are pinpointing is, I have become all things to all men. I mean, we can do anything we want, is the way they interpret that. They're not reading the verse before, nor are they reading the fact that what Paul's saying here. Basically what Paul is saying is we need to incarnate ourselves. As God incarnated himself and became a man and became one of us, so must we incarnate ourselves and become like the people that we are preaching to, the people that we are introducing the gospel to. Basically, where we're at. We need to be all things to all men. When we're working amongst the Gentiles, we need to be as a Gentile to them. Now, does that mean that we lie or cheat or do anything dishonorable? Absolutely not. Why? Because in verse 21, but I am under Christ's law, because we have a corrective, and that is Christ's law. We're not permitted to do that. Now, in Philippians 1, verse 18, Abdullah and Issa claim that we can use false motives according to this verse here. In verse 15 it says, it is true, some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry. I think you need to start with verse 15 to know what verse 18 is saying. Start with verse 15 and you'll see why verse 18, or what Paul says in verse 18, makes all the sense in the world. It is true, some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The former, those who preach out of envy and rivalry, preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. Paul was in prison at this time, 2 years he'd been in prison. Others were preaching outside and they were trying to outdo him, trying to become more popular than he was. There was a wrong motive. They were trying to basically take over, well, I guess you might say they were trying to take a little bit off his glory, or you might say his authority in that area. And so he was saying, this is understandable. I understand it's not the right motive. But then what he says in verse 18, but what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives like these people are doing, or true, Christ is preached. See, it's the message that's important, what Christ is saying. He's not at all supporting what they're doing. He's not at all saying that he likes their motives. He's not at all saying that he himself is calling us to do that. What he is saying is, despite it all, nonetheless, Christ is being preached. It's the message that's important. And you know, in some ways, that's what I would say to Abdullah and Issa. Regardless of whether you like what we're saying, or how we say it, or whether we're debating or dialoguing, it's Christ crucified that we preach at all costs. We're always preaching Christ crucified and resurrected. Paul's saying that here as well. There are many people that preach with insincere motives. In this case, they were competing with Paul. But Paul was still content because he realized that despite the fact that they were not probably doing it for the right intentions, they were talking about Christ. And because of the fact they were talking about Christ, he was still happy. And so are we. And then you go on to verse 7 of chapter 3 of Romans 3 verse 7, which says, someone might argue, if my lying enhances God's truthfulness and so increases his glory, why am I still condemned as a sinner? So here you're saying, Paul is saying we can lie. Read the beginning of the verse. Come on, guys. Goodness sakes. It's right there in black and white. Someone might say. Basically, he's quoting other people who might say this, not he's saying this. If by my lying, this might enhance God's glory. And then look at the next verse right after, verse 8. Why not say, as we are being slanderously reported, like you are slanderously reporting Paul in this case, and as some claim that we say, let us do evil that good may result. In fact, you guys, you're doing the same thing that Paul's exactly saying here in verse 8. Take a look and you've fallen right into the trap. Look what Paul says at the end of that verse. Their condemnation is deserved. You are condemned for doing that. I can't believe sometimes when you guys throw these verses at us. You've not read not even the beginning of the verse 7 or the end of verse 8. If you just look at the two verses, you will see that he is basically standing against lying. He's saying some say that if we lie, God will be endeared. Absolutely not. You are condemned if you're saying that. And the fact that you're putting these words into Paul's mouth is exactly the very thing that he is condemning. Don't put these words into Paul's mouth. You have no right to do that. Scripture stands against you. Paul stands against you. We all stand against you. Be careful. If you're going to read our scripture, at least read the whole verse. And then read the next verse and look at the context. Good on you. I know you tried well on this one. Didn't work. We are not permitted to lie. No, we are not permitted to deceive. That's how we follow Jesus Christ. And those who do lie and deceive, they don't follow Jesus Christ. Okay then, this is Jay in Kazan. Over and out.